Lucia Rivera's life was quiet, dedicated to saving animals one paw at a time. Her veterinary clinic was her sanctuary, a place of healing and peace. But when she rescued a magnificent dog from the wreckage of a hit-and-run, she had no idea she was inviting the devil himself to her door. She thought she was just saving a dog's life. She didn't know its owner was a man who took whatever and whoever he wanted. She didn't know that her simple act of kindness would trap her in a golden cage, and that the man who owned the dog would soon decide he owned her too. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day, and let me know where you're watching from in the comments. The rain fell in relentless, slanting sheets, turning the city streets into a slick black mirror that fractured the neon lights into shimmering chaos. Inside the Rivera Animal Wellness Clinic, the world was a cocoon of warmth and antiseptic quiet. It was the only glow on the block, a lonely beacon against the dreary November night. Dr. Lucia Rivera was wiping down the last of the stainless steel counters, the rhythmic squeak of the cloth a familiar, comforting end to another long day. Her dark hair was pulled back in a messy bun, stray strands clinging to her temples, and the exhaustion she felt was a satisfying ache, born of purpose. Then the night shattered. A horrifying screech of tires, tortured and prolonged, ripped through the muffled drumming of the rain, followed by a sickening, percussive thud that felt like a punch to the gut. Lucia's head snapped up, her heart instantly hammering against her ribs. Her body moved before her mind had fully processed the sound. She dropped the cloth, her worn sneakers squeaking on the linoleum as she grabbed her emergency kit from its hook by the door. She didn't hesitate, didn't pause to grab a coat, plunging out into the downpour as if pulled by an invisible string. The air was cold and thick with the smell of wet pavement and acrid exhaust fumes. A sleek black car, its taillights a fading red smear, was already disappearing around the far corner, leaving behind a terrible silence. In the middle of the street, illuminated by the lonely glow of her clinic's sign, lay a large dark form. It was utterly motionless. Lucia's breath caught, a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. Her professional training kicked in, a calm, cold wave that washed over the initial surge of fear. She sprinted across the asphalt, the cold rain plastering her hair to her face and soaking through her thin scrubs in seconds. As she drew closer, the form resolved into the shape of a dog, a truly massive animal whose powerful limbs were sprawled at an unnatural angle. A weak, pained whimper escaped its throat, a sound so full of misery it pierced through Lucia's professional armor. Kneeling in a puddle that immediately soaked the knees of her pants, she opened her kit, her fingers moving with practiced speed. "It's okay," she murmured, her voice a low, soothing counterpoint to the storm. "It's okay, big guy. I've got you." The dog was a Cane Corso, its black coat matted with rain and something darker. Its breathing was shallow, its eyes glazed with pain and shock. Her hands, gentle but firm, moved over its body, assessing the damage. The distant flashing of a traffic light painted fleeting red stripes across the tragic scene, a silent, rhythmic witness to the quiet fight for life that had just begun. Under the sterile, shadowless lights of her operating room, the sheer scale of the dog's injuries became terrifyingly clear. He was magnificent, a mountain of muscle and sleek fur, but he was broken. A compound fracture had pushed a shard of bone through the skin of his left hind leg. His breathing was labored, and a quick ultrasound confirmed Lucia's worst fear: internal bleeding, likely from a ruptured spleen. Severe lacerations crisscrossed his flank and head, deep gashes that spoke to the violence of the impact. Lucia worked with an intense, almost reverent focus, a silent dance of practiced movements. She administered the anesthesia, watching the dog's massive chest rise and fall in a steady rhythm as he slipped into unconsciousness. The chaos of the street outside felt a world away, replaced by the quiet hum of machinery and the soft clink of surgical steel. She meticulously cleaned the wounds, set the fractured bone with a plate and screws, and then, with the delicate precision of a master seamstress, began the long process of suturing the torn tissues. As she worked, her mind raced. There was no collar, no tags to identify him. But as she cleaned a cut near his ear, her fingers brushed against something unusual. Parting the fur, she found a subtle, almost invisible tattoo on the inner flap of his ear. a stylized crest she didn't recognize. A quick scan with her handheld device revealed a microchip embedded beneath the skin of his shoulder. Someone spent a fortune on you, big guy, she thought, her brow furrowed in concentration. You're no stray, so who would just leave you to die? The thought planted a seed of unease. This was not some neglected animal, this was a prized possession. The kind of animal owned by someone with resources, someone with power. She continued her work, talking to the unconscious giant on her table, her voice a soft, steady murmur. It was a habit she'd formed long ago, a belief that even under anesthesia, a soothing presence could aid in healing. Hours later, the fight was won, for now. The dog, whom she had started calling Brutus in her mind, was stable, resting in a large recovery kennel. An IV line dripped fluids into his vein, and a thick bandage encased his leg. Lucia was slumped in a chair in the waiting room, the adrenaline having long since faded, leaving a profound bone-deep exhaustion in its wake. She was sipping a cup of lukewarm coffee, the silence of the clinic a welcome blanket. It was nearly 3 a.m. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the quiet space. It wasn't the tentative, worried rap of a pet owner. This was a sound that demanded entry, a hard, impatient summons. Wary, Lucia set her mug down, her body tensing. She moved to the front door, peering through the small glass pane. Standing on her doorstep, seemingly untouched by the rain that still drizzled from the sky, was a man who radiated an almost physical aura of power. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit that did little to hide the formidable build beneath it. His face was a study in severe, masculine beauty, with a strong jaw and high cheekbones. But it was his eyes that held her, dark and piercing. They seemed to see right through the door, right through her. Standing a respectful distance behind him were 2 other men, both large and silent, their presence turning the quiet street into a stage for some unspoken drama. The stark contrast was almost comical. His expensive, perfectly dry suit and her damp, dog-hair-covered scrubs. She unlocked the door and opened it a few inches, a barrier of wood and will. "I believe you have my dog." His voice was a low, smooth baritone, completely devoid of panic or question. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm certainty of a man who was never wrong. Lucia clutched the edge of the door, refusing to be intimidated. "I have a dog that was the victim of a hit and run," she corrected, her own voice firm. "He's in critical condition. And you are?" A flicker of something, perhaps surprise at her tone, crossed his severe features before being suppressed. "I am the one who was notified his microchip was scanned at this address. Allow me to see him." He didn't wait for permission, pushing the door open with a gentle but irresistible pressure, forcing her to step back. The scent of antiseptic and clean linen in her clinic was immediately overpowered by his cologne, a subtle, expensive fragrance of sandalwood and something else, something metallic and dangerous. His 2 shadows remained outside, silent sentinels guarding the entrance. He walked into her clinic as if he owned it, his dark eyes scanning the space before settling on her. "His name is Brutus." Lucia led him to the recovery kennel, her heart a nervous drum against her ribs. The man, Rafael Moretti, though she did not yet know his name, stopped, his gaze fixed on the bandaged form of the dog. For the first time, a flicker of genuine emotion crossed his face, a deep, unmistakable concern. He watched the steady rise and fall of Brutus's chest, his jaw tight. Lucia began to explain the extent of the injuries, the surgery she had performed, the long road to recovery ahead. She spoke in calm, clinical terms, the language of her profession a shield against the intimidating presence beside her. He listened intently, his gaze shifting from the dog to her face and back again. When she was finished, he gave a curt nod. "You did well." He then turned, walked to the reception counter, and placed a sleek leather briefcase upon it. He opened it with 2 sharp clicks. Lucia's breath caught in her throat. It was filled with stacks of cash, neat bundles of $100 bills, far, far more than the most generous estimate for the surgery and recovery could ever amount to. "This should cover your expenses," he said, his tone dismissive, as if the money were an inconvenience. "The bill is not nearly that much," Lucia started, flustered. "And besides, he needs to stay here for at least a week for observation. Moving him now is too risky." He needs constant monitoring. Rafael looked at her, his dark eyes unreadable. That won't be necessary, he said, his voice dropping into that same low, authoritative tone. He will recover at my home, he paused, his gaze sweeping over her, lingering for a moment that felt far too long. And you will come with him. You will be compensated for your time. Of course. He gestured vaguely at the open briefcase. Name your price. Lucia stared at him, a hot surge of indignation washing away her fear and exhaustion. The sheer, unmitigated audacity of the man was breathtaking. My clinic isn't for sale, she said, her voice tight with anger, and neither am I. The dog's health is my only concern, and my professional opinion, as the veterinarian who just spent 4 hours saving his life, is that he stays. A strange look crossed Rafael's face. It was a mixture of surprise and something else, a flicker of dark amusement. It was the look of a man who was not used to being told no, who found the experience novel, almost interesting. He looked from her defiant face to the dog, then back to her. He slowly closed the lid of the briefcase. The sharp snap of the latches echoed in the silent room. A sound of finality, a gavel striking down on a verdict she hadn't known was being decided. The offer was no longer a negotiation. It was a command. In that moment, Lucia saw a chilling clarity in his dark eyes. He had come for his dog, but he had decided he was keeping them both. There was no discussion, no room for argument. One of Rafael's silent men retrieved a specialized transport crate from a black SUV that had materialized at the curb, its engine a low, menacing rumble. Lucia watched, numb, as they carefully loaded the still sedated Brutus into the vehicle. She was handed her own small emergency kit, the familiar weight of it doing nothing to ground her. She was then gestured, not asked, into the back of a different vehicle, a black luxury SUV with windows so heavily tinted they seemed to absorb the city lights. The door closed with a heavy, satisfying thud, a sound that sealed her off from the world she knew. The interior was a cocoon of black leather and polished wood, utterly silent. One of Rafael's men was in the driver's seat, another in the passenger seat, both as still and silent as statues. Rafael himself slid in beside her, his presence filling the confined space, making the air feel thick and hard to breathe. The car pulled away from the curb with a smoothness that belied its size. Lucia stared out the window, but her clinic, her entire life, was already swallowed by the darkness and the distorting tint of the glass. The city, with its familiar grid of streets and chaotic energy, began to blur. The journey was unnervingly quiet. The only sound the faint whisper of the tires on the wet road. They drove for what felt like an eternity, leaving the dense urban landscape behind for winding roads flanked by dark, imposing trees. The city's glow faded from the sky, replaced by an inky, starless black. Lucia clutched the handle of her bag, her knuckles white. It was her only link to her normal life, a small, tangible piece of a world that felt a million miles away. She felt like she had been kidnapped, a ridiculous thought since she had, technically, walked to the car herself. But the choice had been an illusion, a courtesy extended by a predator. Finally, the SUV slowed and turned, passing through a set of massive wrought iron gates that swung open for them without a sound, operated by some unseen hand. The gates were topped with cruel, sharp spikes, designed not just to keep people out, but to keep them in. They proceeded up a long, winding driveway, bordered by perfectly manicured lawns that looked sterile and unnatural in the headlights, like a green carpet laid over concrete. The estate, when it came into view, was not a house. It was a fortress, a sprawling mansion of stone and dark wood. It loomed against the night sky, its windows dark save for a few warm, golden squares. It was beautiful in a cold, intimidating way, a monument to power and paranoia. Lucia's anxiety, which had been a low hum in her chest, crescendoed into a silent scream. This was not a home. It was a cage. Rafael led her through a cavernous foyer with a marble floor and a chandelier that dripped crystals like frozen tears. Their footsteps echoed in the oppressive silence. He guided her up a wide, curving staircase and down a long, carpeted hallway to a set of double doors. He pushed them open, revealing not a room, but a suite. It was larger than her entire apartment, A spacious living area with a plush sofa and a fireplace gave way to a massive bedroom with a king-sized bed and floor-to-ceiling windows. But it was the attached room that made her stop. It had been converted into a state-of-the-art veterinary recovery room. Cages of various sizes lined one wall, a stainless steel examination table stood in the center, and cabinets were filled with what she recognized as the best and most expensive medical supplies on the market. Everything she could possibly need, and more, was there. Rafael gave her a perfunctory tour of her designated area, his tone that of a proprietor showing off a new acquisition. He pointed out the fully stocked medical supplies, all top of the line, and the amenities for her comfort, including a walk-in closet where a wardrobe of new clothes, still in their wrappings, hung waiting. He showed her how to use the small, discreet intercom panel on the wall. "You will use this to request anything you need," he explained. "Food, drink, any other supplies. Someone will bring it to you immediately." The luxury was a suffocating trap. As he spoke, Lucia's eyes scanned the room, her professional instincts for observation now turned to survival. The beautiful large windows, she noted, had no visible handles or locks, the glass thick and seamless, likely reinforced. The heavy wooden door to the suite had a complex electronic lock on the outside, but only a simple handle on the inside. And as they had walked down the hall, she had caught a glimpse of one of his men, standing discreetly in an alcove, his posture relaxed but his eyes alert. Rafael was creating a perfect, inescapable environment for her, a gilded prison designed for his new pet and its keeper. "You will have everything you need here," Rafael said, his voice pulling her from her assessment. "Brutus's recovery is the only priority." Lucia found her voice, though it felt thin and brittle. "This is excessive. He would have been fine at my clinic." Rafael's dark eyes lingered on her, a slow, deliberate appraisal that made her skin crawl. "I don't settle for fine, Lucia," he said, the use of her first name a casual claim of intimacy that she despised. "I ensure the best, for everything I value." The implication hung in the air between them, heavy and suffocating. He valued his dog, and now, it seemed, he valued her. And Rafael Moretti took possession of everything he valued. Later, she was summoned to dinner. A silent servant, a woman with a perpetually downcast gaze, had appeared at her door to lead her to the mansion's formal dining room. The room was vast and cold, dominated by a long, polished mahogany table that could have easily seated 20 people. A fire crackled in a massive stone hearth at one end, but its warmth didn't reach the far corners of the room. They sat at opposite ends of the table, the vast expanse of polished wood a chasm between them. The distance was clearly intentional, a demonstration of his power and her isolation. Another silent servant began to serve a multi-course meal, each plate a work of art, the food more exquisite than anything Lucia had ever eaten. The silence was heavy and uncomfortable, broken only by the soft clinking of silver on porcelain. Rafael finally spoke, his voice echoing slightly in the cavernous room. He began to ask her questions. At first, they were about Brutus, but they soon shifted to her. He asked about her life, her family, her education. He inquired about her clinic, its finances, its profitability, the number of staff she employed. It didn't feel like a conversation. It felt like an intelligence-gathering operation, a systematic dissection of her life. He was mapping her existence, learning its terrain. Lucia felt exposed, like a specimen under a microscope. She gave clipped professional answers, volunteering nothing, trying to reveal as little of herself as possible. She spoke of her degree, the loan she took out to start her business, her single assistant, Maria. She kept her answers brief and to the point, a gray rock against the waves of his probing questions. She realized with a chilling certainty that he was trying to understand her, to find her pressure points, her weaknesses, her price. She thought about the profound, bitter irony of the situation. Here she was, eating food that probably cost more than her clinic's weekly budget, in a house that felt more like a museum than a home, a silent prisoner in a designer dress that had been laid out for her on the bed. But all she wanted was the simple, mundane comfort of her own small apartment, the familiar taste of takeout eaten on her worn sofa, the freedom to walk out her own front door. The luxury was a poison. and she could feel it seeping into her, trying to lull her into compliance. She ate what was on her plate, forcing herself to swallow past the lump of fear in her throat, knowing that every bite was a small, unwilling acceptance of her new reality. Later that night, after checking on Brutus, who was resting as comfortably as could be expected, Lucia's resolve hardened. This was a misunderstanding, a gross overreach of his authority that she would correct. He was used to getting his way, but she was not one of his sycophants. She was a doctor. She had a life, a business to run. Packing her small bag with a defiant energy, she prepared herself for the argument to come. She would be firm, professional. She would explain again that she could make daily visits, that his current course of action was unnecessary and unacceptable. She zipped the bag shut with a sense of purpose. She would be going home tonight. As if summoned by her thoughts, the door to the suite opened and Rafael appeared in the doorway. He didn't knock. He simply entered, his large frame filling the space. He saw the bag in her hand, and a slow, cold smile touched his lips. It didn't reach his eyes. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice deceptively soft. "Yes," Lucia said, standing tall, her chin lifted. "The dog is stable. I've written down a detailed care schedule. I can check on him daily, but I need to get back to my clinic. I need to get back to my own life." He took a slow step into the room, then another. He stopped just a few feet from her, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. The cold smile was gone, replaced by an unyielding hardness. He informed her in a voice that was no longer soft, that her stay was not temporary. "Your clinic will be taken care of," he stated, as if discussing a minor logistical detail. "My office has already been in touch with your assistant. Your appointments have been canceled for the foreseeable future. Any lost income," he added with a dismissive wave of his hand, "will be compensated tenfold. Your life, for now, is here, with my dog." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in, his gaze unwavering and intense. He was a hawk, and she was the small, struggling creature caught in his talons. "And with me." The floor dropped out from under Lucia. The air rushed from her lungs, leaving a hollow ache in her chest. The pretense was gone, stripped away to reveal the raw, terrifying truth of her situation. She was a prisoner. The carefully constructed walls of her life, her independence, her identity, had been demolished with a few casual sentences. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her, but it was immediately followed by a hot, surging wave of defiant anger. She stared at him, her eyes blazing with a fury that she was sure he could see. He simply watched her, his expression unchanged, a man utterly confident in his power to hold her there. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod, as if she had just confirmed something to him. Then he turned and walked out, the door closing behind him with a soft, final click of the electronic lock. Lucia stared at the closed door, the smooth, unblemished wood a symbol of her new prison wall. The reality of her situation, in all its terrifying, gilded horror, crashed down on her. Days bled into a week, each one a perfect, sterile copy of the last. Lucia, a creature of habit and discipline, imposed a rigid structure on her formless confinement. Her world shrank to the dimensions of the suite, the library, and a vast glass-walled indoor garden. But within that world, she became a meticulous observer. Her mornings began with Brutus. His health was steadily, miraculously improving. The deep gash on his flank was healing into a clean pink line, and the swelling in his leg had subsided. He was now able to limp around the suite, his heavy tail giving a tentative thump, thump, thump against the Persian rugs whenever she approached. His affection for her was a tangible thing, a warm, solid presence in the cold opulence of the mansion. He would rest his heavy head on her lap as she read, his deep brown eyes following her every move. This bond became her anchor, the one pure and uncomplicated truth in a world of lies and luxury. She used her time to explore, always aware of the silent guards who materialized in doorways and at the ends of hallways, their presence a constant low-grade hum of menace. She walked the permitted paths of her prison. She wasn't sightseeing, she was reconnoitering. In the library, surrounded by the scent of lemon polish and old books bound in leather she could never focus on, her eyes scanned for unsecured windows, for patterns in the guards' patrols she could see on the grounds below. In the humid, cloying air of the indoor garden, a riot of exotic plants trapped under glass, she noted the thickness of the panes, the electronic locks on the doors, the placement of discreet dome-shaped cameras nestled amongst the orchids and ferns. The house was a fortress, but every fortress had a weakness. Her mind, trained to diagnose the hidden ailments of the body, was now bent on diagnosing the vulnerabilities of her cage. It was a slow, frustrating process, a chipping away at a mountain with a teaspoon, but Lucia was not one to despair. Her mind was constantly working, planning, observing. Her helplessness was a cloak she wore, but beneath it, her resolve was sharpening into a fine, hard point. Late one evening, a storm raging outside in a poetic echo of the night they met, Lucia was on the floor of the suite, gently massaging the muscles around Brutus's healing leg. The dog was a picture of contentment, his eyes half closed, a low rumble in his chest. The door opened without a sound, and Rafael stood there, watching them. He had shed his suit jacket, and his white shirt was open at the collar, the sleeves rolled up to his forearms. For a moment, he just watched, his expression unreadable in the dim light from the fireplace. Lucia tensed, expecting an order, a question, another casual assertion of his ownership. Instead, he walked to a small bar in the corner of the living area and poured 2 fingers of amber liquid into a heavy crystal glass. He didn't speak, simply moved to one of the armchairs and sat, swirling the contents of his glass. The only sounds were the crackling fire, the howling wind, and the soft sigh from the contented dog. He was a reckless thing, Rafael said suddenly, his voice a low murmur that barely carried across the room. Lucia looked up, surprised by the conversational tone. Always running into trouble. He once jumped off a second-story balcony into the pool because he saw a squirrel on the other side. A faint ghost of a smile touched his lips, a fleeting expression of memory. He reminds me of someone who didn't know how to be careful. He took a slow sip of his drink, his eyes distant, fixed on a past she couldn't see. He told her then, not in a rush, but in quiet, measured sentences, how he had gotten Brutus. The dog had been a puppy, a gift from his younger brother, Matteo. He didn't elaborate on what happened to him, only that he was someone important he had lost. The story, spare as it was, revealed a crack in his cold marble facade. Lucia's hands stilled on Brutus's leg. "He's not reckless," she said softly, her gaze meeting his across the room. "He's brave and very loyal." Rafael looked at her, truly looked at her, and for the first time, she didn't see a captor. She saw a man haunted by grief, a man whose cruelty was perhaps a shield built around a wound. The glimpse of vulnerability was profoundly unsettling. It complicated her narrative of him as a monster, a simple villain in her story. It made him harder to hate, and that, in itself, was a new kind of danger. It was one thing to fight a monster. It was another thing entirely to fight a man who mourned. The flicker of connection, however, was not enough to quell the rising tide of her frustration. Another 2 days passed. She had tried the intercom, requesting, then demanding, to speak to her assistant, Maria. Her requests were met with polite, infuriating deflections. "Everything is being handled, Dr. Rivera. There is no need for you to be concerned." The condescension was galling. Her business, the one thing in the world she had built with her own 2 hands, was being handled by faceless minions, and she was expected to sit quietly in her cage. The anger finally boiled over. Bypassing the intercom entirely, she walked out of her suite. The guard in the hall, a thick-necked man named Leo, straightened in surprise as she strode past him. "Ma'am, you should," he started, but she ignored him, her steps echoing with a purpose that brooked no argument. She didn't know where his office was, but she followed the undeniable pull of power, moving through the silent, cavernous halls until she found a set of dark, oak doors. She didn't knock. She pushed them open and walked in. Rafael was seated behind a massive desk of the same dark wood, the room paneled and masculine, smelling of old leather and his expensive cologne. He looked up from a ledger, his eyes narrowing in surprise, then hardening into cold fury as Leo appeared, flustered in the doorway behind her. Rafael dismissed him with a curt, angry flick of his wrist. The guard vanished, closing the doors behind him. They were alone. "This wasn't our arrangement," Lucia began, her voice shaking slightly with adrenaline but gaining strength with every word. She planted her hands on the polished surface of his desk, leaning forward. "You are destroying my livelihood. My assistant is alone. My patients need me. I demand to go to my clinic." Rafael leaned back in his chair, his expression turning glacial. His voice, when he spoke, was dangerously low, a predator's growl. "You are in no position to make demands. You are here because I require it. Your clinic, your life, it all continues or stops at my discretion. You would do well to remember that." A reckless fire surged in Lucia's chest. She was bluffing, and she knew he would know it. But the words tumbled out anyway, a desperate gambit born of pure frustration. "And what if I refuse to treat Brutus any longer?" The challenge hung in the air, vibrating with tension. She would never, ever harm the dog. Her loyalty to her patient was absolute, a core part of her being. But the threat, the first real defiance she had shown him, changed the dynamic in the room. He stared at her, his jaw so tight a muscle jumped along his cheek. He saw the unbreakable resolve in her eyes, the fierce, cornered courage that he had found so amusing at first. But it wasn't amusing now, it was formidable. He saw that she would not break, she would only fight, and for some reason he couldn't articulate. A part of him was impressed. He made a calculated decision, a strategic concession. He would let her have this small victory, but it would be on his terms. "Fine," he said, the word clipped. "You will visit your clinic, tomorrow for 1 hour." The trip back to her world felt like visiting a foreign country. She sat in the back of the same black SUV, this time with 2 different guards, their faces grim and impassive. The city seemed louder, dirtier, more chaotic than she remembered. When they pulled up in front of Rivera Animal Wellness, her heart ached with a fierce, possessive love for the small, unassuming storefront. Her guards did not enter. They took up positions on the sidewalk outside the front door, their tailored suits and imposing presence turning her humble clinic into the site of a hostage situation. Their message was clear to every passerby, every neighbor, every client. This place, and the woman inside it, were under new management. The moment she stepped inside, the familiar, comforting smell of antiseptic and animals was tainted with a new scent, the metallic tang of fear. Her assistant, Maria, a bright, cheerful young woman barely out of her teens, rushed to greet her, but the smile on her face was brittle, her eyes wide with terror. "Dr. Rivera, they said you were on a private consultation," she whispered, her gaze darting nervously towards the large front window, where the dark shadows of the guards loomed. "I am, Maria." "Everything is fine," Lucia lied, her voice sounding hollow even to her own ears. The visit was a tense, awkward nightmare. She tried to act normal, reviewing charts and checking supplies. But the presence of the guards poisoned the atmosphere. She saw how Maria flinched at every passing car, how her hands trembled as she tried to input data into the computer. This was worse than being in the mansion. There, she was the only prisoner. Here, his control was a contagion, infecting her world, her life, the people she cared about. It was no longer just about her. As she was giving Maria instructions, her gaze drifted out the window to the shop next door, a small bookstore that had gone out of business a month ago. A large orange for lease sign was plastered in its window. An idea began to form, a tiny, desperate seed in the scorched earth of her hope. The need to escape became urgent, absolute. She looked at the fear in Maria's eyes and realized she couldn't fight him head-on. She couldn't win a war of strength. She had to be smarter, she had to be invisible, she had to play a different game entirely. The visit to her clinic had changed the very chemistry of her captivity. The anger, the raw, defiant fury that had fueled her, had cooled into something harder and more dangerous, a cold, calculated resolve. She understood now that rattling the bars of her cage was useless. It only served to remind the zookeeper of her presence. To escape, she had to make him forget he even had a key. Lucia Rivera, the veterinarian, the healer, became an actress. The role she chose was that of the broken pet, compliant, gentle, and grateful for the comforts of her gilded prison. Her transformation was subtle, a masterpiece of deception. She began to smile at the household staff, the silent women with downcast eyes who brought her meals and cleaned her suite. She learned their names, asked about their families in quiet, brief exchanges in the hallways. She was no longer the angry, pacing captive. She was Dr. Rivera, the pleasant, slightly sad woman who was so devoted to the big dog's recovery. She spent hours in the library, not searching for escape routes on architectural plans, but poring over obscure botanical texts and online herbalist forums. She was building a fiction, a lie so detailed and specific, it would feel like truth. She started making small talk with Rafael during their silent, tense dinners. She would ask about the art on the walls, the history of the estate, anything to fill the oppressive silence with the sound of compliance. He was pleased. She could see it. He mistook her strategy for surrender, believing his will had finally eroded hers. He saw her newfound pleasantness as the result of his generosity, the inevitable outcome of surrounding a person with enough luxury. He believed he was finally breaking her, taming her, and it made him careless. After a week of this meticulous performance, she made her move, during one of their now routine late-night conversations in the suite. With Brutus snoring softly at her feet, she brought up his recovery. "His leg is healing wonderfully," she began, her tone professional and earnest. "The bone is setting perfectly, but I'm concerned about nerve regeneration and scar tissue. In cases like this, with older injuries, I've had remarkable success with a supplement, a specific herbal poultice." Raphael looked at her, intrigued. "And you don't have what you need here?" he asked, gesturing to the small fortune in medical supplies he had provided. "Unfortunately, no," Lucia said, shaking her head with practiced regret. "It's not a conventional treatment. The main ingredient is Arnica montana, but it has to be a specific subspecies, harvested at high altitude. It's combined with St. John's wort and a binder made from comfrey root. It's very rare. There's only one place I know of that sources it reliably, a small holistic market in the Old Quarter. They import it from a specific region in the Alps." Every detail was a carefully polished stone in the edifice of her lie. He was silent for a long moment, studying her face. She met his gaze without flinching, her expression a perfect mask of professional concern. She was counting on his obsession with providing the best for Brutus, the same obsession that had imprisoned her. Finally, he nodded slowly. "Fine, we will go tomorrow." Lucia's heart leaped, a frantic bird beating against the cage of her ribs, but she kept her expression placid. "Thank you, I can just give you a list. You can send one of your men." "No," he cut her off, a possessive glint in his eye. "I will take you myself." He was pleased with her, and this was her reward. A trip into the city, chaperoned by her captor. It was a test, she knew, but it was also an opportunity. It was the first crack in the wall of her prison. A grim satisfaction settled over her. She was playing a dangerous game, but for the first time in weeks, she was no longer just a pawn. She was a player. The city was a sensory assault. After weeks in the monastic silence and climate, controlled perfection of the Moretti estate, the chaotic, vibrant life of the streets felt alien and overwhelming. The smell of street food, the distant wail of a siren, the cacophony of a dozen different conversations. It all washed over Lucia as she sat in the back of the armored SUV. Raphael was beside her, silent and imposing, his presence a constant reminder that this was not freedom, it was merely a longer leash. They were heading toward the Old Quarter, a labyrinth of narrow streets and historic buildings. The perfect place for her fictional market, and, she hoped, the perfect place to create a diversion and slip away. As their driver navigated a particularly narrow street, slowed by the midday traffic of delivery trucks and pedestrians, it happened. The world dissolved into a screech of metal and a bone-jarring impact. A heavy sedan, appearing from a side alley, rammed into the side of their SUV with incredible force. Lucia was thrown against Raphael, the air forced from her lungs in a sharp gasp. Before their vehicle could recover, a second car, a black town car, screeched to a halt in front of them, blocking any chance of escape. The quiet city street erupted. Doors of the other cars were thrown open and men spilled out, their faces hard, their hands holding guns. They were not common thugs. They moved with a chilling, professional purpose. The rival Falcone family. Lucia's blood ran cold. Her carefully constructed plan, her clever lie about herbs and markets. It all evaporated in a cloud of pure, unadulterated terror. This was a world she had only seen in movies, a brutal reality of violence and death that had now smashed its way into her life. The windows of the SUV, reinforced and bulletproof, starred and cracked as the first shots were fired. The sound a deafening, percussive roar that vibrated through the entire vehicle. The city sounds, the music, the chatter were gone, replaced by a symphony of violence, the pop, pop, pop of gunfire and the tinkling shatter of glass from nearby storefronts. In the split second between the impact and the first gunshot, Rafael moved. There was no thought, no hesitation, only a primal, instantaneous reaction. His arm shot out, not to grab a weapon, but to grab her. With a force that knocked the breath from her, he shoved her down onto the floor of the car. His voice, a low, urgent command, shouted over the rising chaos. "Stay down, don't move." Before she could even process the order, his entire body was covering hers, a shield of muscle and resolve. Pinning her to the plush carpet, Lucia was crushed beneath him, her face pressed into the thick wool of his suit jacket, which smelled of his cologne, and now, faintly, of cordite. The world was a terrifying, muffled cacophony of bangs and shouts from outside. She could feel the vibrations of each bullet impacting the armored shell of the car, each thud a reminder of the death that was trying to get in. She was trapped, not just in the car, but under the very man who had trapped her in his life. It was the ultimate, terrifying irony. His body was a dead weight, heavy and absolute, but it was also a barrier. She could hear his heart, a steady, calm beat against her ear, a stark contrast to the frantic hammering of her own. He was completely still above her, a mountain of flesh and bone absorbing the shockwaves of the battle raging outside. He issued calm, precise commands to his men, his voice never rising, never betraying a hint of panic. "Driver, reverse, now! Use the alley! Marco, left flank, suppress them!" He was a general in a battle, and she was the territory he was refusing to cede. Terror was a living thing inside her, a cold, clawing creature in her chest. But tangled with it was another emotion, something she was ashamed to even acknowledge, something profoundly confusing. It was a sense of safety. In this moment of extreme, mortal danger, the man she hated, her captor, her jailer, was the only thing keeping her alive. His presence, which had been a source of constant anxiety and oppression, was now, paradoxically, a source of profound security. She was pressed against him, feeling the solid, unyielding strength of his body, and a part of her, a primal, terrified part, was grateful. She hated him for putting her here, she hated him for owning her, but in the middle of a firefight, she couldn't deny the visceral truth that his body, covering hers, was the safest place in the world. The experience was rewriting her understanding of him, of them in real time, blurring the sharp lines she had drawn between good and evil, captive and captor, into a terrifying, confusing gray. The firefight ended as quickly as it began. The squeal of tires, a final desperate burst of gunfire, and then a ringing silence, broken only by a distant car alarm and the sound of Rafael's steady breathing in her ear. He didn't move for a long moment, his weight a heavy, reassuring pressure. Then he shifted, pushing himself up. Cool air rushed into the space where he had been. He looked down at her, his face a mask of cold fury, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a different emotion, a raw, naked concern. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice rough. She could only shake her head, her own voice lost somewhere in her throat. He reached down and pulled her up, his grip firm on her arm. She stumbled onto the seat, her body trembling uncontrollably. The adrenaline was fading, leaving a deep, bone-chilling shock in its wake. The interior of the car was a wreck, the windows shattered into opaque spiderwebs, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder. Outside, the street was a scene of carnage. Their driver, bleeding from a cut on his forehead but alive, was already on the phone, his voice low and urgent. The other car was gone. The ambush was over. The ride back to the mansion was silent, but it was a different silence than before. It was heavy with the weight of what had just happened, thick with unspoken fear and fury. When they arrived, Rafael gripped her arm and pulled her from the car, marching her through the house and directly into his office. He didn't release her until the heavy oak doors were closed behind them, shutting out the rest of the world. He let go of her arm and began to pace the room, a caged tiger whose territory had been violated. His movements were tight, coiled with a rage so potent it seemed to make the air vibrate. He wasn't angry at her, she realized. He was furious at the Falcones, at the audacity of the attack, at the vulnerability they had exposed. He finally stopped pacing and turned to face her, his eyes burning with a cold, hard light. "Do you understand what happened today, Lucia?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Do you understand what they saw?" He didn't wait for an answer. "They saw you, with me. They don't know who you are. They don't care. All they know is that you were with me and that I protected you. In their world, that makes you one thing." He took a step closer, his shadow falling over her. "A weakness, a pawn, a piece to be taken off the board or used against me." Lucia stared at him, the last vestiges of her hope turning to ash in her mouth. The escape plan, the clever deception, it had not only failed, it had backfired in the most catastrophic way imaginable. She had wanted to get outside the walls of her prison, and in doing so, she had painted a target on her own back. "Your plan to leave," he continued, his voice merciless. "Your little games with herbs and markets, they are over, finished." He was standing directly in front of her now, his presence overwhelming. He reached out, not to touch her, but to gesture around the opulent office, at the fortress that surrounded them. "From this moment on, any possibility of you leaving is gone. This is no longer about my desire to keep you. This is about your survival. They will not hesitate to take you, to hurt you to get to me." He looked her straight in the eye, his gaze unwavering, sealing her fate with his words. "I am now your self-appointed protector, Lucia, because I am the only one who can be. This mansion is your only safe harbor. The gilded cage has become your fortress, and you are locked inside for your own good." He paused, letting the finality of his declaration settle over her like a shroud. "From now on, you do not leave my sight." Lucia's hope, which had been a flickering candle flame, was extinguished. She had traded one kind of prison for another, a far more dangerous one. She was no longer just a captive held by a possessive man's whim. She was a target in a war she didn't understand. Her life now inextricably tied to the violent, dangerous fate of Rafael Moretti. The days that followed the ambush were a new kind of prison. The gilded cage had become a fortress, and Rafael's words, "You do not leave my sight," were a literal decree. He was a shadow she could not shake. If she was in the library, he was there, reading reports in a leather armchair. If she tended to Brutus, he would appear, watching from the doorway. The illusion of space she once had was gone, replaced by a suffocating, constant proximity. The fear from the attack lingered, a cold residue in her veins, but something else was taking root in the barren ground of her captivity, a cold, hard pragmatism. Direct escape was not just impossible, it was suicide. The Falcones were out there, and they had seen her face. Her old life was a distant shore she could no longer see, and her only hope of survival was to learn how to navigate the treacherous waters she was in now. So, Lucia made a conscious, terrifying decision. She stopped fighting the current. In the vast, silent library, surrounded by the wisdom of ages, she began her own study. Her subject was Rafael Moretti. She began to observe him with the same detached, analytical eye she used to diagnose a difficult case. She watched the way he held his glass, the subtle shift in his posture when one of his men entered the room, the way his eyes would soften for a fraction of a second when he looked at Brutus. She started to engage him in conversation, not with the defiant challenges of before, but with a calculated, intelligent curiosity. She was no longer rattling the bars. She was studying the zookeeper. "This painting," she said one afternoon, gesturing to a dark, turbulent seascape that dominated one wall of the library. "It's beautiful, but also violent. Why did you choose it?" He looked up from his papers, surprised by the question. "I didn't choose it. It was my father's." He said it reminded him that even in a storm, there is order, and a man with a strong ship can ride it out. "And do you agree?" she pressed gently. A long silence stretched between them. "I believe it's better to be the storm," he finally said, his eyes meeting hers. It was a small thing, a tiny crack of insight. But she filed it away. She began to ask him about his business, not the illegal specifics, but the logistics, the strategy. She framed her questions with a disarming academic curiosity. It must be complex managing so many interests, she would muse. The supply chains, the personnel. It's like a complex biological system. All the parts have to work in harmony, or the whole organism fails. He was intrigued, she could tell. No one had ever spoken to him about his empire in this way. They feared it, or they wanted a piece of it. No one had ever tried to simply understand its mechanics. This was her new strategy. It was not surrender, it was infiltration. She felt like a spy in enemy territory, a biologist studying a predator in its natural habitat. Knowing that a single misstep could get her killed. The irony was a bitter pill. To gain her freedom, she had to get closer to the man who had stolen it. She had to understand his world to find a way out of it. Their late-night talks, once a source of dread, became her primary field of study. One evening, a cool breeze drifting in from the open doors of the grand terrace, she decided to probe the one area he had ever shown vulnerability. Brutus was asleep at their feet, a great breathing mountain of loyalty. The security lights of the estate cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, a perfect sterile landscape. Brutus is almost completely healed, she began, her voice soft in the quiet of the night. He has a remarkable constitution. He must have been a very strong puppy. Rafael swirled the brandy in his glass, his gaze distant. He was, he said, a clumsy, reckless fool, all paws and teeth. Lucia waited, letting the silence stretch. She had learned that with Rafael, silence was a tool. He would often fill it just to maintain control. You said he reminded you of someone, she prompted gently, referencing their conversation from weeks ago. He looked at her, his eyes dark and shadowed. The alcohol, or perhaps the quiet of the night, had lowered his defenses. He seemed to make a decision, to allow a piece of himself to be seen. My brother Matteo, he said, his voice losing some of its hard edge. Brutus was his dog. He proceeded to tell her the full story, not the abbreviated version from before. Matteo was his younger brother by 5 years. He was not like Rafael. He was not built for their world. He was too soft for this life, Rafael said, a note of old, unresolved grief in his voice. He saw the good in people, even when it wasn't there. He loved art, music, animals. He looked down at the sleeping dog. He loved this dog more than anything. He explained that years ago, in the opening salvo of the war with the Falcones, they had ambushed Matteo. It wasn't a battle, it was an execution. And when they were done, they had left Brutus, then just a young dog, for dead beside his master's body. It's their signature, Rafael said, his voice turning to ice. A message. We can take what you love, and we will defile it. They did the same thing the night you found him. Ran him down and left him to die in the street. It was a message for me. The revelation hit Lucia with the force of a physical blow. It didn't excuse his actions. It didn't absolve him of imprisoning her, but it provided a sudden, blinding context for his paranoia, for his obsessive attachment to Brutus, for the fortress he had built around his life. The dog wasn't just a pet. He was a living, breathing link to a murdered brother. He was a symbol of everything Rafael had failed to protect. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of genuine sympathy, an emotion so unwelcome and confusing it made her furious. She hated him for making her feel it. She hated this new complexity, this blurring of the lines. She wanted him to be a monster, a simple, two-dimensional villain. But the man sitting across from her, cloaked in shadow and grief, was terrifyingly, heartbreakingly human. While Lucia was navigating the psychological complexities of her captivity, the war outside the mansion walls continued. One of Rafael's men, a quiet, efficient man named Silvio, was now tasked with the security of Lucia's clinic. He would check on it daily, ensuring Maria was safe and that there were no signs of trouble. One afternoon, as he did his sweep, he found a plain white envelope that had been slipped under the front door. There was no name on it, no address. His training screamed at him that this was wrong. He carefully picked it up, his gloved fingers noting the weight of the paper. Inside the clinic, he slid it open. The note was typed. The message brief and chilling. It was addressed to the dog doctor. It spoke of her family, how they must miss her, how sad it would be if something were to happen to them so far away. It was a veiled threat, made more sinister by the fact that the Falcones clearly didn't know she had no family nearby. The note ended with an offer, a simple sentence that dripped with poison and promise. "There is a way out of the cage. We can help you." Silvio felt a cold dread creep up his spine. He immediately folded the note, placed it in an evidence bag, and drove back to the estate, his foot heavy on the accelerator. The Falcones were no longer just attacking, they were recruiting. Rafael was holding the note between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a venomous insect. He had summoned Lucia to his office, the room where she had first defied him, the heart of his power. He was standing by the window, his face like stone, silhouetted against the fading afternoon light. He didn't speak, just watched her walk across the room, his eyes searching hers, trying to read her before she even knew what she was being accused of. He held the note out to her. Lucia took it, her hand steady despite the sudden, frantic beating of her heart. She read the typed words, her blood turning to ice. The threat against a family she didn't have was terrifying in its carelessness, a sign of their utter ruthlessness. Then she read the last line. "There is a way out of the cage. We can help you." It was a key, a poisoned key, but a key nonetheless. Her mind raced, 1,000 possibilities exploding in an instant. She could pretend to agree. She could use this, feed them false information, arrange a meeting, escape in the chaos. It was a chance, a desperate, dangerous chance. "They are offering you your freedom," Rafael's voice cut through her thoughts, low and dangerous. He had moved to his desk, leaning against it, his arms crossed. He was watching her, testing her. "Everything you said you wanted, a way out. All you have to do is help them get to me." He let the offer hang in the air, a tangible thing. "This is your chance, Lucia. What do you do?" This was it, the turning point, the ultimate test. Her mind flashed back to the ambush, the shattering glass, the deafening roar of gunfire, the feeling of Rafael's body shielding hers. She thought of his story, of his brother Mateo, left dead in the street. She looked at the note in her hand, at the casual, cruel threat against a non-existent family. These men, the Falcones, they were not offering her freedom. They were offering her a different, more temporary cage. They were ruthless killers who would use her as a tool and dispose of her the moment she was no longer useful. Her survival, she realized, with a sudden, chilling clarity, was ironically better guaranteed with the devil she knew. Lucia looked up from the note, her gaze meeting Rafael's. She held his stare, letting him see the decision in her eyes. Then slowly, deliberately, she took the note from his hand. With a single decisive motion, she ripped it in half and then in half again, letting the small white squares flutter from her fingers onto the polished floor. "They're animals," she said, her voice clear and steady, devoid of any fear. "And I don't help animals who kill for sport." A profound silence filled the room. Rafael stared at the pieces of paper on the floor, then back at her face. The suspicion in his eyes, the cold, hard mask of the Mafia boss, began to crumble. He had expected her to hesitate, to bargain, perhaps even to lie. He had not expected this. He had not expected this clear, unequivocal alignment. For the first time, he saw not a pawn, not a captive, but a partner. Her choice had not been made for him. It had been made for herself, a calculated act of self-preservation. But in doing so, she had chosen a side. She had chosen his side. In the ruins of her old life, in the heart of her prison, a fragile, dangerous, and undeniable trust was born. The act of tearing the note was a declaration of war on her old life and an enlistment in his. The shift in Rafael was immediate and profound. The suspicion that had been his constant companion around her finally receded, replaced by something she had never seen in him before, a raw, unguarded respect. That evening, he didn't summon her to his office. He invited her. He led her not to the library or the terrace, but to a room she had never seen. A room hidden behind a paneled wall in his study. It was his war room. The space was a stark contrast to the opulent decor of the rest of the mansion. It was a cold, high-tech hub of screens and servers, displaying security feeds, financial data, and encrypted communication lines. It was the brain of his empire, the place where the strings were pulled. By bringing her here, he was showing her the man behind the curtain, the true source of his power. He was making her a part of it. "The Falcones," he began, his voice all business, gesturing to a large central screen displaying a complex organizational chart. "Are old money, but new desperation. Their patriarch is dying, and his son, Marco, is an arrogant fool. He's trying to prove himself by taking what's mine." He explained their operations, their front businesses, their key players. Their weaknesses. He spoke with a cold, clinical detachment. But Lucia listened with the focused intensity of a surgeon studying a patient's chart. She was looking for the underlying pathology. She was not a strategist, not a killer, but she was an expert observer of behavior. She saw things his men, trained in violence and intimidation, had missed. She pointed to patterns in their movements, in their financial transactions, small tells that spoke of their psychology. "You think like a predator," she said, her voice steady as she looked at the screen, at the faces of the men who had tried to kill her. "So do they. You're both circling each other, looking for the moment to strike the throat, but I think like a veterinarian. I look for the weakness, the underlying sickness. Theirs," she said, tapping a picture of Marco Falcone, a handsome man with cruel eyes, "is arrogance. The note they sent me proves it. They think I'm a terrified, helpless woman, a damsel in distress. They believe their own narrative." An idea, audacious and terrifying, began to form in her mind. "So let's use that," she said, her voice gaining strength. "Let's use their sickness against them. You want to trap the leader? Don't hunt him like a wolf. Lure him in like a sick animal. I'll be the bait." She proposed a plan, not of violence, but of deception. She would respond to their offer. She would feign cooperation, promising them information, promising them access to Rafael, all in exchange for her freedom. She would lure Marco himself into a meeting, into a place of their choosing. Rafael stared at her, his expression a mixture of shock and awe. His men would have proposed an ambush, a car bomb, a frontal assault. She was proposing psychological warfare. He saw the brilliance in it and the immense danger. "They will kill you without a second thought," he said, his voice a low growl. "They'll have to get in line," Lucia replied, a flicker of dark humor in her eyes. "And they won't, because Marco will want to see me himself. His ego won't allow him to send a subordinate. He'll want to be the one who turned the great Rafael Moretti's woman. He'll want to gloat." She was right, and they both knew it. The trap was set. The meeting was arranged for an abandoned warehouse in the industrial district, a neutral ground chosen by the Falcones, a detail Lucia had insisted on to make her cooperation seem genuine. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a sweater, a stark contrast to the designer clothes she wore in the mansion. She was wearing a wire, its cold metal a small, uncomfortable pressure against her skin. Rafael had personally fitted it, his fingers surprisingly gentle as he taped it in place, his jaw tight with a tension that was more than just strategic concern. "The code word is Mateo," he had instructed, his voice low and rough. "The moment you say it, we move in, not a second before." Now standing in the vast, dusty emptiness of the warehouse, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay, Lucia felt a fear so profound it was almost paralyzing. This was insane. She was a vet, a healer. She was about to willingly walk into a meeting with a killer, but then she thought of Maria's terrified eyes, of the life that had been stolen from her, and the fear hardened into a cold, sharp resolve. Marco Falcone arrived with 4 men, just as she had predicted. He was as arrogant in person as he was in his photograph, his swaggering confidence filling the empty space. He dismissed her with a cursory glance, his eyes sweeping over her as if she were a piece of furniture. He began to talk, to gloat, explaining how they would use her to get to Rafael, how she would be their key to dismantling his empire. Lucia played her part perfectly. She trembled. She kept her eyes downcast. She stammered out questions about her payment, her escape. She was everything he expected her to be, a terrified, greedy woman looking for a way out. "You give us the access codes to his private server," Marco said, stepping closer, his breath smelling of stale coffee. "You tell us his routine, when he is most vulnerable. You do that, and we will give you a new life. A lot of money. Anything you want. Lucia looked up, her eyes wide with feigned hope. And Rafael, she whispered. Marco laughed, a short, ugly sound. Don't you worry about him. We'll take care of him. A problem like that requires a permanent solution. He smiled, enjoying her fear. Just like we took care of his little brother, Matteo. The name, spoken so casually, so cruelly, hung in the air. It was the code word. Lucia's heart hammered against her ribs. This was the moment. But as she opened her mouth to speak, something went wrong. One of Falcone's men, his attention wandering, glanced up towards the high, grimy windows of the warehouse. His eyes widened, a flicker of reflected light, the glint of a sniper's scope, catching his attention. "Boss, it's a trap!" he screamed. The world exploded. The trap was sprung too early. The warehouse, which had been silent moments before, erupted in a deafening storm of gunfire. Rafael's men, hidden in the rafters and behind stacks of old crates, opened fire. In the instant of chaos, Marco reacted. He lunged for Lucia, his arm wrapping around her throat like a band of steel, pulling her back against his chest. He pressed the cold muzzle of his pistol to her temple. She was a human shield. The fighting was a blur of noise and violence. But through the chaos, another sound emerged, a deep guttural roar of pure fury. Rafael had insisted on bringing Brutus, a good faith measure to show Lucia was truly alone, but in reality, another layer of protection. The dog, held back by a handler near a side entrance, had seen his mistress grabbed. The handler, a 250-pound man, was no match for the primal rage of the Con Corso. Brutus broke free. He was a black blur of muscle and teeth, a missile of loyal fury launched across the warehouse floor. He didn't hesitate. He leaped, his powerful jaws closing on Marco Falcone's gun arm. The crunch of bone was sickeningly loud. Marco screamed, a high, thin sound of agony and surprise, his grip on Lucia faltering as his arm was savaged. The dog, a creature of pure, protective instinct, had done what no sniper could. He had created a clear shot. From the rafters, a single sharp crack echoed, distinct from the chaos of the automatic weapons. Marco's head snapped back, and he crumpled to the ground, his grip on Lucia finally releasing. The firefight was over in seconds. The silence that descended was more shocking than the noise. It was a dead, ringing silence, thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and blood. The Falcone threat was over. Lucia stood trembling, her breath coming in ragged gasps, staring at the carnage around her. Then Rafael was there. He dropped from a catwalk, landing lightly on his feet, his own gun still in his hand. He rushed to her, his eyes wild with a terror and relief so raw it stripped away the cold mask of the Mafia boss completely. He grabbed her, his hands checking her for injuries, his touch surprisingly gentle. "Are you hurt, Lucia, are you hurt?" he asked, his voice hoarse. She could only shake her head, her legs giving way. He caught her, holding her up. He looked at her, then at Brutus, who was now sitting faithfully by her side, a low growl still rumbling in his chest, his muzzle stained with blood. In that moment, Rafael Moretti was not a monster or a kingpin. He was just a man who had almost lost the one thing he had come to value more than his own life. The external threat that had bound them together in this strange, violent alliance was gone. The war was over, and in the silence of the aftermath, only one question remained. What were they now? The next day, the sun shone with a kind of defiant cheerfulness, as if the world was oblivious to the violence that had transpired in its shadows. The mansion was quieter than ever, the victory leaving a strange, hollow echo in its wake. Rafael found Lucia in the garden, sitting on a stone bench, staring at a rosebush as if it held the answers to the universe. He didn't speak, just stood before her until she looked up. "Come with me," he said, his voice soft. He led her through the house, their footsteps the only sound, and out the grand front doors. A black car was waiting, its engine idling, a driver standing patiently by the open rear door. On the ground beside it was a single expensive leather suitcase, the massive wrought iron gates of the estate, the gates that had sealed her into this world, were standing wide open. The road beyond led back to the city, back to a life she barely remembered. He was giving her the choice he had denied her at the very beginning. He was setting her free. "The car will take you anywhere you want to go," he said, his voice steady, though she could see a muscle jumping in his jaw. "The suitcase has $1.2 million in it. Your clinic is safe. It's yours, unencumbered. Everything is as it was." He paused, his dark eyes searching hers. "You are free, Lucia. I will not stop you." He took a breath, and the next words he spoke were softer than she had ever heard them, stripped of all authority, all command. They were a plea. "But I am asking you to stay." Lucia stared at him, her heart a confused, painful drum in her chest. "As your prisoner?" she asked, the word tasting like ash in her mouth. "No," he said immediately, shaking his head. "Never again. As my equal." He took a hesitant step closer. "As the only person who has ever seen all of me, the monster and the man, and not run away. The only person who makes this empty place feel like a home." This was the true climax, the final, terrifying choice. Lucia looked past him, at the open gate, the ribbon of road that represented her freedom. She could walk away. She could take the money, rebuild her life, and pretend the last few months had been a terrible nightmare. She could go back to being Dr. Rivera, the quiet woman who saved animals. Then she looked back at the imposing mansion that had been her prison, her fortress, and now, impossibly, her home. She looked at the dangerous, complicated man standing in front of it, offering her not a cage, but a kingdom. She thought of the quiet, simple life she had lost, and then she thought of the thrilling, terrifying, and strangely, deeply fulfilling life she had found within these walls. She had been brought here as a captive, but she had become a queen. Slowly, she shook her head, not in refusal of his offer, but in acceptance of her decision. She turned her back on the open gate, on the